Ricky's Journal, May 9th, 2023. Bruised egos on Twitter this morning. Lies about teching throws. These lobbies are afraid of me. I've seen their true face. This tower is an extended gutter, and the gutter is full of salt. And when the drains finally fill up, all the games will stop. The accumulated despair of all their tear lists and grief will foam up about their waists, and they all will look up and shout, "Teach us." And I'll look down and whisper, "Oh yeah, sure, fine, that'll be fun. I'm happy to help whenever I can." 10,000 hours. That's right, 10,000 hours is all that's standing between you and achieving your wildest dreams. Maybe you want to be a painter, an astronaut, an internationally famous super idol, or maybe you just want to learn how to actually play that guitar you bought after finishing Bocchi the Rock. All you need is a measly investment of 10,000 hours of your time, and it can all be yours. Or that's what I would say if I wanted to lie to you. Odds are that you've heard this line trotted out somewhere before. The magic number for true expertise, 10,000 hours. It's one of the big ideas from Malcolm Gladwell's 2008 bestseller, Outliers. He based it off of Erickson et al.'s 1993 paper on the development of expertise, which looked at the practice habits of professional violinists. But as with anything in pop psychology, many of the nuances of that paper were lost in translation. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but 10,000 hours of practice isn't going to make you an internationally famous super idol. It's a real bummer if you're, well, me. The good news is that there is a kernel of truth here. Yes, it does take time to cultivate expertise. However, it takes more than just time, because not all time is going to be time well spent. And this is something that's been on my mind a lot lately. It's May, and Combo Breaker, one of the biggest and arguably the best fighting game event of the year, is quickly coming up. As with every year, I've seen folks posting about how much time they're sinking into games to get prepared. Many of those posts are later followed by feelings of frustration with a perceived lack of progress relative to the amount of time the person has spent. Unfortunately, we don't live in a perfectly fair world, and practice isn't a clean game of inputs and outputs. Just because you spent 6 hours one evening practicing doesn't mean that you moved yourself 6 hours closer to your goal. Depending on what you were doing, you might not have made very much progress at all. There is a method, dare I say even a science, to effective practice. In that initial paper back in 1993, Erickson et al. Coined the term deliberate practice. Since then, there have been a number of revisions to their original definition, but for this video, I'm going to go with this. Deliberate practice requires effort and concentration, is focused on improving performance, follows a clearly defined structure, includes feedback in a timely manner, and finally involves repetition to put that feedback into practice. Effort, focus, structure, feedback, rinse, and repeat. At this point, you might be thinking, "Hey, you there with the soothing voice. What makes you so qualified to talk about this?" Well, I'm glad you asked, convenient hypothetical person that I made up for this example. Behind this soothing voice and radiant character model, I'm also a doctor of psychology. I think a lot of folks out there could benefit from knowing more about how to make the most of their time, because after all, your time is valuable. So let's get into it and talk about some underlying psychology and learning, and then get into some applied examples of how we can put that into practice, getting you closer to your goals. Alright, let's take a couple of minutes here and learn a little bit about learning. Specifically, I want to focus on two different psychological factors here and the role they play in learning, and that's automation and attention. There's a good chance that if I were to ask you to tie your shoes, you would know how to do it. If you've transcended your humanity and embraced the sage wisdom of Crocs, then just pretend that I asked you to ride a bike instead. These are two things most people learn how to do when they're very young. Now, what if I were to ask you to teach somebody else how to tie their shoes? That would be a little bit harder, right? You'd probably have to stop and think about it a little bit more than you'd even like to admit. It's likely that you haven't had to think very hard about what it takes to tie your shoes in many, many years. When we are first learning how to do something, we tend to focus on all of the individual steps of the process and how they all fit together. As we get better, our brains tend to automate the process, and the steps start to blur together until we don't really think about them separately anymore. As we get better, our brains tend to automate the process, and the steps start to blur together until we don't really think about them separately anymore. It can even become challenging to work backwards and try to think about them individually again. Our brains naturally gravitate toward automation, but to understand why, we're going to have to segue a bit and talk about attention. Attention can be best thought of as a depleting resource. You can visualize it as fuel in a tank, if that helps. Personally, I like the spoon analogy. You have so many spoons throughout the day, and you spend them doing different tasks. Getting out of bed takes a spoon, skimming a book takes another spoon, actually reading that book might take 2 or 3 spoons, and so on and so on. However, the spoon cost isn't the same for everyone. If you're new to something, you might need more spoons compared to somebody with more experience. That's because all people, including super psychological idols like me, are what we call cognitive misers. Basically, our brains try to spend as few spoons as possible on any given task. Attention is a critical resource, so it's best to save it for when we really need it. It's not just how we pick out and focus on factors in our environment, it also plays a critical role in other processes like how we form new memories. Holding information in your short-term memory, focusing on it, and paying attention is how we form long-term memories that we can call on later. If you're not paying attention to something, either because you don't want to or because you just don't have spoons to spare, then it becomes harder to form new memories. And if you're listening to this video in the background while doing something else and I were to say something like, "Hey, you over there, what did I just say?" Odds are, you might not be able to remember even though you might have been listening. You weren't encoding that information into long-term memory because your attention was diverted elsewhere and you missed out on all of these pearls of wisdom that I'm just handing out for free over here. Back to the point of departure, our brains are totally fine with just being good enough to get the job done. What defines good enough is up to you. If you're just looking to play a casual 9 holes with friends, you don't need to keep focusing on all the minute details of your golf swing. But if you're trying to kill people in golf, like in the anime of all time, Birdie Wing Golf Girl's Story, you need to keep pushing yourself. You can think of it kind of like leveling up in a role-playing game. Early on, even just mere exposure to a skill is enough to help you improve. We actually have a whole system of neurons called mirror neurons that activate just by watching other people as if we were doing the thing ourselves. If you take nothing else away from this video, now you know where the neuron activated meme comes from. Eventually though, you're going to reach a point where just watching somebody else isn't going to be enough to help you improve. Kinda like how beating up level 1 and level 2 enemies is eventually not going to improve your skills anymore in a video game. Keeping with the golf example, the next logical step would be to pick up a club for yourself, and when that's no longer enough to help you improve, you go find something else to do, rinse and repeat as long as you're interested in improving. Once you reach a point that is good enough and you stop actively trying to improve, your brain kicks into gear automating the process so you don't have to spend as much attention on it going forward. Regardless of whether it's music, art, academics, really anything, continuing to improve means swimming upstream against your brain's natural tendency to automate. So let's put all this together with a quick recap. Attention is a limited resource. It's the fuel for a number of important mental processes, including how we learn new skills. In the early phases of learning a skill, we have to think about all the individual steps of a process, making it more attention intensive. As the process becomes more familiar, it becomes easier until eventually we don't really need to think about it anymore. This is because our brains naturally gravitate towards spending as little attention as possible. This is fine for everyday tasks, but works against continual improvement. So let's talk about some practical ways to apply all of this into deliberate practice to get you where you want to be as efficiently as possible. For this video, I'm mostly going to focus on using fighting games as examples, but all of this applies broadly to things like art, music, sports, really anything. If you're familiar with the culture around fighting games, then you're probably already familiar with the idea of a first to death. If you're not, instead of playing to a set number of wins, the two players will rematch until one of them gives up, either because they're tired, exhausted, mentally broken, or have just something else to do. These sets can last for hours with well in excess of 100 games played. Or maybe your idea of practice is hopping online and spending a few hours just playing whoever sits down and then never interacting with them again. At a surface level, just playing a lot might seem like a good use of your time. Now, what if I told you that top-level international musicians only practice for about 4 hours a day on average? People who compete and perform at the highest level often do less unstructured practice compared to their peers. In a study comparing the practice habits of soccer players, or football players if you're from outside the US, elite players spent more time in decision-making and tactics activities and less time in unsupervised play when compared to sub-elite players. After you reach a certain baseline of skill, just practicing without some kind of structure to it doesn't benefit you all that much. With that in mind, let's refresh on what we mean by deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is effortful, focused on performance, follows a set structure, incorporates feedback, and offers chances to incorporate that feedback into future attempts. You can start applying all of that right now, literally right now. I know you're on your computer, so just take a second, open up Notepad, and write down 3 things that you want to work on the next time you practice. These should be concrete things that you can focus on, ideally even things that you know you struggle with. Saying you want to make a certain rank or win a number of times before you lose a game just ain't it, chief. Maybe you notice that you've been dropping a difficult combo at the same part every time. Maybe you struggle to rotate your options during a match and you're aware that you tend to use the same 2 or 3 tools over and over again. The next time you sit down to play, bring up that list and really focus on it. Try to really think about the things you're doing and apply that while you're playing. You're probably going to also find that this stretches your attention and you're gonna have trouble focusing after a while, and that's good. It means that you're concentrating, you're putting in effort, and remember, deliberate practice is effortful. So when you find yourself feeling worn out, give yourself a break. The goal is to add structure to your practice via actionable goalposts, but that's still only just one part of the process. We also need to think about feedback, and I don't just mean rank points or the number of likes that your art gets on Twitter. Good feedback can come from a number of different places. The good news is that one of those is actually you. Yes, you, the person watching this right now. Remember a few seconds ago when I talked about focusing on 3 specific goals while you're playing? Just check in with yourself about your progress. It's an easy way to give yourself feedback. And if you feel like you've made progress on one of those goals, consider swapping it for something else that you feel like you're having more difficulty with. You can even give yourself better feedback by reviewing your own work. Most modern games have a replay function, making this easier than ever. After you finish playing for a bit, go back and review your matches. Now you can check in on your progress without the distraction of also having to practice at the same time. This shift in perspective might also help you notice things that you otherwise might have missed. Ideally, you're also going to want to do this as soon as possible after you finish practicing, when you can still remember what you were thinking and feeling at the time. And if you can think back a couple of minutes to all that stuff about attention and remembering, retaining information about what you were thinking and feeling while practicing is also going to take up some of your attention. This is another reason to avoid playing for long periods of time without structure. Sure, you might be able to sit down and be satisfied with yourself having played 100 games in a marathon session, but do you really remember what happened in those individual games? If I were to ask you what happened in the second round of the 65th match, would you remember anything? Odds are not. When you're practicing deliberately, it's best to go in short spurts, so log on, play a handful of games, review them, and then put what you learned into practice. Good feedback can also come from other people. I first started applying deliberate practice a couple of years ago when a friend noted my extremely unfortunate propensity for mashing rematch well after it was clear that I was no longer focused. He suggested that we play with a new set of rules. If either of us won 3 games in a row, we would stop, take a break, and review those games before playing any more. To date, it is the most I have ever improved in a short period of time. Those breaks gave me a chance to recover some of my attention, and breaking down matches right after playing them gave me insights that I otherwise would have missed, both into my own play but also into how my opponent was playing against me. Better yet, if I had any questions about his decision making or how things went down or what he was thinking at any point in the match, I could ask him. You can do something very similar, even online. Find somebody to play with, play a short set, and then try to review it with the person afterwards. Even better, if you two can talk about what your goals are before you sit down, you can tailor your feedback based on what you know your opponent is looking to improve on. It's eye-opening to sit down with someone and compare what you two were thinking and feeling at different points in your practice session. There is one group of people that I want to pay special attention to while we're talking about this idea of getting feedback from other people. The original definition of deliberate practice also required that the feedback comes from an expert, like a teacher or a coach. Later studies have disputed how important that is in the grand scheme of things, but I still want to touch on it. Sure, there are services where you can hire someone for one-on-one coaching, but there are other ways that you can get feedback from an expert. If you're practicing art, there might be an artist that you especially admire. For example, I think that Ask's art style is gorgeous, and I'd like to learn how to paint in this style. I can go to Pixiv, look at their work, take notes, and then do a piece trying to imitate that style as a learning exercise before going back, comparing, and trying again. In some cases, your chosen role model might even publish tutorials or make all of their files available as learning tools for people that want to learn to paint like them. It's not the same as a one-on-one coaching session, but it can still be a source of excellent feedback. That same idea can also apply to sports and especially games. Find a player you admire, look through their matches, and take notes on their decision making to try to get insight into why they play the way that they do. When I'm doing something like this, I find that I'm often stopping a video every couple of seconds to take notes. I try to imagine myself in the game and what choices I would be making in each situation. Then press play, see what the person that I'm watching actually does. Maybe they mash a fast attack because they recognize that they can interrupt their opponent, or they jump away anticipating a throw, or they make the incredibly brave decision to just block. If I find that they are doing things differently, I try to understand why they are doing it, and also introspect into why I'm making the decisions that I am. Maybe there's information that happened earlier in the match that I might have overlooked, but they were paying attention to. Then I take those differences as feedback and I use it to inform what topics I can structure my future practice around. If you find that while you're trying to do this that it is exhausting, good. Personally, I can only review a couple of games like this before my brain is kaput and I need to take a break. No matter where you're getting your feedback from, this is the heart of deliberate practice. You set specific things that you want to work on that you know you're already not very good at. You practice them, you get feedback, and then you use that feedback to inform what you're going to focus on going forward. This keeps your brain in the early phases of learning and helps work against your brain's natural gravity towards automaticity. Now that you're an expert on deliberate practice, you might be wondering, why don't more people do this, and why didn't you do it sooner? It seems easy, but it's actually very difficult, just maybe not for the reasons that you would expect. Yes, setting guidelines for your practice, seeking feedback, and then using that feedback to revise your guidelines is easy enough. But consider that one of the core ideas here is focusing on things that you know you are not already good at. In some ways, you're setting yourself up for failure, or at the very least, potentially frustrating situations. The whole point here is to find areas outside of your comfort zone, and then once they start to feel comfortable, it's time to move on. Then factor in that you have to focus on your weaknesses and then go off and try to get feedback on them. You have to be publicly working on things. You gotta be vulnerable, and when you put all that together, maybe this doesn't sound very fun, does it? Unsurprisingly, many experts rate that their time spent deliberately practicing is less enjoyable than unstructured practice. That original article on the subject, Erickson et al. 1993, even draws a line between play and practice. Play is done primarily for the purpose of enjoyment, and practice is done primarily for the purpose of improvement. Play is rewarding in itself. It feels good to do things that you know that you're good at. It is reassuring to do things within your comfort zone. And you might even get a chance to bask in your own glory and feel yourself every now and then. On the other hand, the rewards from practicing come later, and in some cases might not even come at all. This is where some of the stuff that I've talked about in other videos comes into play. Specifically, I'm thinking about mindfulness and self-compassion. One of the key factors in making sure that you do get to see the fruits of your labor is being consistent in your practice. And it's hard to be consistent if you're getting frustrated and burning out. Being nice to yourself is another important part of practicing deliberately. You are going to fail to meet your goals sometimes. You are gonna have days where things just don't seem to be coming together and you wonder what you're even working towards. You might even have days where you want to throw your hands up and scream that you're just not talented. These are the times that you're gonna have to rely on those self-compassion skills most of all. Because iron doesn't forge iron, and beating yourself up is not going to get you any closer to where you want to be. If anything, it'll just burn you out faster, so remember to take a break every now and then. Maybe go have some ice cream or something. You deserve it. And if you don't believe me, if you need some kind of reassurance or you're looking for permission, let me just say the fact that you finished this video, that you're putting yourself out there, that you're working on things that you know you're not good at, you're trying to pick up new skills and you're putting the time and the work in, that is impressive. That is badass. I don't need to know anything about your progress or your skill level to know that you deserve a break, maybe even a little treat. You've just got to trust that you are going to improve. To the extent that you can control it, you're going to get where you want to go. It just might be a longer journey than you'd like it to be. But consider that if you don't believe in yourself, you can't really ask anybody else to. And that's what I've got for this time. This has been a departure from the other kinds of things that I've been working on, so let me know if this was useful. I hope it was. There's this whole thing called the curse of knowledge where once you know something, it's hard to imagine that other people don't know it. So leave a comment or something and let me know if you'd like to see more stuff like this, or if this was useful, or if you learned something. I'd like to do more content like this, but sometimes that curse of knowledge kicks up and I'll get into a project and then think, man, is that really not something that people already know? And that never happens. So yeah, let me know. I might take a break from videos next month to recoup some creative energy, work on art for a bit, and maybe do some charity streaming for Pride Month, but we'll see what happens. Until next time though, be nice to yourself.